Good afternoon and welcome to Daily Maverick's webinar on this fine Thursday, October the 15th. The subject of today's webinar is the climate risks we face in the first half of the 21st century. And we really do have a world-class panel today. We have Bob Scholes, distinguished professor at the Global Change Institute at Wits University in Johannesburg. Bob is a world-renowned systems ecologist and is ranked in the top 1% of citations amongst environmental scientists around the world in their peer-reviewed papers. And we have Makoma Lekalakala from Earth Life Africa, famous as one of the spearheads of the anti-nuclear campaign and winner of the Goldman Prize, the most celebrated and distinguished environmental prize on Earth. Our topic of conversation today, for which we have to thank ABSA. ABSA were instrumental in allowing us to commission the report from the Global Change Institute, looking at the top risks we face in terms of climate collapse, again, in the first half of the 21st century, and ABSA also sponsoring today's event. So thank you for ABSA. But before we go into the questions, just an overview. You can find on the website a summary of that report. But that report weights the top 5 risks, starting with food security, second, water security, third, a just transition to a low-carbon economy, fourth, heat stress, and fifth, biodiversity and ecosystem collapse. Now, I would like to start off with Bob, because I know there was an intricate and very rigorous process behind the scoring. And the question to Bob is, how exactly does GCI conceive of risk and weight risk in a report of this nature?
So we follow the procedures which are now quite well established internationally around risk assessment, particularly in the climate change arena, as followed by groups such as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And we need to take a very broad look at risk. We don't simply look at narrowly what is the biophysical change. In other words, how much harder will it rain, or how much drier will it become? You also have to look at what the receiving environment is, because the same level of risk for a receiving environment which isn't vulnerable is not as important as one that is very vulnerable. So you've always got to be doing this interplay between the biophysical side and the social side. And we also think of risks in a whole series of different categories. It's not only the direct risks resulting from the changing climate, which is what we refer to as biophysical risks, but for instance, there are also things called transitional risks. So as you go from what you're used to doing to what you might need to do in the future, you are going outside your knowledge zone and your comfort zone, and you can incur a bunch of risks there. And then from a business perspective and from a national perspective as well, you also have to consider things like reputational risk. And we've seen some examples of loss of reputational risk in South Africa in the last few weeks. Big supermarket chains getting wrapped up in inappropriate advertising campaigns, for instance. That's an enormous risk to them. And the same thing can happen if you're, on the sort of wrong side of the climate debate as well. And then finally, we can also talk about direct legal risks. So around the world at the moment, there are 500 different court cases going on of people taking major climate change driving organizations to court, saying, hold on, you've caused me some material losses here. You need to be responsible for those. And then the actual procedure we follow is that we generated a long list of very specific kind of risks. Things like, will the fire intensity increase in the Fynbos? Will the sea level rise in eThekwini? All kinds of very specific risks like that. We then passed those in front of expert teams. And the expert team scored those risks in terms of how likely is this to occur? And then secondly, what are the consequences if it does occur? And then by multiplying those two together, you get a ranking of risks. And we took the top 25% of those, the most likely of 25% of that came us down to 13. And then we looked at those and we saw that many of them were quite related. They behaved in the same way in relation to climate change and affected the same sectors. So we clustered those into the 5 categories which are in the report, those 5 broad categories. It's much more helpful for people to be able to think about 5 things than to think about 50 things. And that helps us to develop the solution space. We then finally consider those risks in relation to what can be done about them, because if you can mitigate some of those risks, they come down, and we explore some of the reduction in risk as a result of mitigation. So yeah, carry on, Makoma. I see we've lost Kevin from our room, which is a bit awkward. So Makoma, if you want to respond to my comments, feel free to do so.
Yeah, I totally agree with your study and outcomes of the report. Basically, because food insecurity, water, lack of water, and loss of carbon, of biodiversity is one of the pressing issues. But however, I think this all has got to come with our plan for a transition to a low carbon development. And as South Africa, I think we need to transform and to have plans, and that plans should not be a badly or a poorly executed plan towards just transition to a low carbon development. Because if we have a bad plan, that would mean that we're not contributing anyhow to mitigating the risks around climate change. I mean, it's clear now that people have got food insecurity, but it also has been highlighted by the pandemic, that some of the inequalities were out there. So it would mean that whatever plans that we do have a plan on a just transition to low carbon development, which also speaks or which is guided by the Paris Agreement. And what we have to do with that plan is that we have to ensure that the plan is fair. And the plan does not only benefit those negatively impacted, but also has got to the rest of the economy and the workforce. I think it's for now, for the future, and for the health of the planet. But however, what we have also to say is that we have the power within ourselves to ensure a low carbon transitions that would happen in such a way that the vulnerable sectors of our society, particularly poor people, are not unfairly impacted, and the benefits has got to be to the overall economy and be maximized. So the just transition, it's one of the risks, and if we manage the transition very well, would not have a problem of having climate refugees coming to South Africa or to the Southern African region that also contributes towards massive urbanization. And in the urban areas, this is where some of the negative impacts, the risks becomes much higher than in other places. So I totally agree with that. And for me, the just transition is at the center of ensuring that people have got water, we don't have electricity generation that is water intensive, and that would also contribute towards mitigating against the loss of biodiversity. So we need to plan in such a way that being guided by our national development plan, guided by the nationally determined contribution that comes from the Paris Agreement. And I think that's the way to go. We have the power as South Africans, and we can make it happen. It's not for you and me, but it's for our generation and the next generations.
So I think that the notion of justice is a really important one here. I've always conceived of climate change as fundamentally at its core an ethical problem, not only in the present day, but actually especially in terms of the future. Because remember, we're taking decisions for people who are not sitting at the table. So we always have to kind of think who's representing the future, and to what degree are we constraining their potential for a good life. So I see we've been rejoined by Kevin. Over to you.
Apologies.
Yeah, before Kevin joins,
Makoma.
I think before Kevin joins, I think from what you have said, it's quite important for us to revisit our indigenous knowledge systems for adaptation. And if we have that, I think that is one of the major factors that would help us to mitigate the risks that we're facing today.
So thank you, Makoma, and apologies for the technical glitch. And I do want to come to the indigenous knowledge sort of question and the range of solutions presented there. But before we do, Makoma, as an activist on the ground and having read the reports, and you know what you see the weighting that's given to the 5 factors. Are you in fundamental agreement that that the weighting is correct in terms of where our resources should be focused as activists?
Yes, I totally agree, and I think that was part of my statements to what I commented to what Bob had said.
Okay, wonderful. So then back to Bob. The interrelationship between the risks and the clusters is a major theme running through the report. I mean, I wonder if you could just give an overlap of some of the key areas where we're looking at threat multipliers. The report is fundamentally focused on those threat multipliers.
Yes, indeed. And, you know, one of the things that emerges around something as pervasive as climate change is that things don't pull out neatly in little standalone boxes, because there's always interactions. For instance, there's a very well-known interaction, which is known as the energy water land nexus. So whatever you do in the energy sector has impacts on the water sector and impacts on the land sector, and vice versa. And that plays out, for instance, in some of our clusters. So we do highlight this issue of food security, and of course, food security, more than 2/3 of the water in South Africa is used in agriculture. And so you can see an immediate problem there. If we're running out of water to supply our industries and our cities, the place it's likely to come out of is the allocation to agriculture. And that just makes the food production questions more difficult. There's also really important interactions between, for instance, heat and agriculture, because high heat stress not only affects humans and our ability to perform and in fact, in the end, to survive, but it equally affects warm-blooded animals. So the livestock sector, which is about 1/3 of South African agriculture, gets itself into a situation where it actually, you know, it's just not viable. And that's especially true for things like dairy, because the production of milk is especially energy demanding, and so those animals tend to overheat. So there's a strong heat, agriculture, food security interaction going on there as well. Similarly, if we wanted to address the heat problem in urban areas, one of the things you can do is plant lots of nice, lovely green trees and lawns. And that makes us for a cooler environment because of the evaporative cooling going on through transpiration. But you can't do that if you don't have water. So those are examples of some of the interactions which occur between the clusters we've identified. And the point that you make is that they then become what's called synergistic. In other words, the sum of those things going on at the same time is not just simply adding them up, it's actually more than adding them up.
Okay, so as coincidence would have it, and thank you for that, Bob, because I mean it leads naturally into the next question, and as coincidence would have it, Makoma at the moment is in Mikado, and
yes.
we know why Makoma is in Mikado. It has to do with the Messina-Mikado Special Economic Zone, the 145 billion rand project, backed mainly by the Chinese government and Chinese parastatals, that you know, could effectively destroy the Limpopo River Valley everywhere downstream of Messina. Daily Maverick has run a series of investigations on this issue. Amabongani has followed up as well, And I think in terms of the risk clusters that we're looking at, food security, water security, the just transition is obviously key there, because, you know, in our investigations, what we divulged was that there are plans, that a contract has been signed with Power China International to build a 3,300 megawatt coal-fired power station that will only serve the SEZ. So this is not power that's going to go into the national grid. Now we're touching on the third item in the report, which is the just transition, obviously with heat stress. GCI, when we put together our first article in our Killing the Holy Ghost series, GCI gave us quite alarming statistics on how warm and dry it's going to get in northern Limpopo. And that's the other side of the Soutpansberg in the Baobab country, which is one of our major areas of biodiversity, which is the fifth item in the report. And it's biodiversity and ecosystem breakdown. And that Baobab country is, I mean, it's a national treasure. So, Makoma, what's happening on the ground in terms of this report? How dire is it? How badly do we need to stop this? And most importantly, I mean, Makoma, again, to bring up that you were, you know, a critical part of the anti-nuclear campaign. Do you think the campaign to stop the Messina Mikado SEZ is as important as that?
Yeah, I think personally, I don't believe that we need a campaign, because basically the South African Constitution and the Bill of Rights says, Section 24, that everyone has got a right to live in an environment that is not harmful to their being, and we also have an obligation to protect that environment. And this becomes a direct violation. The proposal of this special economic zone becomes a direct violation of what is contained in the Constitution of South Africa. So in my view, this was not even supposed to be considered at all costs. But however, as we know how things happen in our country, in the past 4 days, I have been with people from representative of community-based organizations, individuals from different villages in and around the area identified as a special economic zone. And people have raised various issues, and those issues are part of the issues that are very concerning. And very concerning in that this project, it's both a violation of the South African Constitution, it's also both the violation of international law, because all what is proposed there, it tells you that this is kind of an insane project that is being proposed here. Firstly, I think coming to the issues that are also contained in the report, there's a great concern around water. And the great concern around water, it's cut across all demographics in the area, including that this is also part of the breadbasket of the country. And when we have this SEZ, Special Economic Zone, that's just going to be destroyed. Particularly also on the report, it raises that when temperature rises, lack of water and the food becomes scarce and the people can no longer afford. There's also issues around health that the people here are raising, that with this mega toxic project, people's health are going to be impacted, particularly that the air quality is just going to be very, very bad in this area. And there's also, people had said that they cannot accept the development of a facility that will contribute so highly to South Africa's already high carbon output and trajectory. This special economic zone is intended to operate for almost 90 years or more, which is well beyond South Africa's current nationally determined contribution targets or reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and pollutions by 2035. But what is much more concerning, it's the uprooting of people's culture, tradition, and belief systems. One, I've attended all the public participation meetings, and one of the last one was yesterday afternoon. And what this report says, it says that the EIA is for the clearing of the site where all these other projects are going to be mining and the coal-fired power station and mine. But then what is not taken into consideration is the heritage impacts in the area. There are sacred sites in the area, there are ancestral graves in the area, and there's the baobabs, the mopani trees, and the marula trees that are woven into people's cultures, traditions, and the way of life. So if the report, the EIA report says almost 100,000 plus trees are going to be uprooted from a 6,000 hectare area, that tells you that it's also part of desertification. And why do we have to get into such insane projects and destroy our being, destroy our people? But I feel that that's why I'm saying this was not even supposed to be considered. Should this be considered, that would mean South Africans, we've lost our pride, because you cannot uproot people's cultures, heritage, and their belief systems. So the air quality in this area, this is one of the most beautiful areas. I think Kevin would agree with me. You come to this area, it's like you're coming from what people here call the area, they say it's Murongoni. It's like what you call your Garden of Eden, you know, your imaginary Garden of Eden. And just imagine all those, that kind of projects come in here, what is going to happen? So that is just going to like fall away and not really define ourselves. But what is much more concerning is that from the environmental assessment practitioners, he said they can do mitigation. I don't know whether you can, what kind of mitigation you can do. There's no area like this in the whole of South Africa that those baobab trees can be uprooted and be taken to another place, and the people's sacred sites cannot be moved. And that is something that I think it's contained as part of the risks. So if this report mentions all the risks of food security, water, loss of biodiversity, and that we should take a just transition seriously. So if we take a just transition seriously, we have a proper plan, not a bad plan. I won't actually be finding myself here and getting views of the people and getting to know what people's concerns are and how their rights are being violated. So it's not on. And the people that we've met for the past 3 days, they also came up with a statement that they are going to submit to the environmental assessment practitioners EIA process. And they also have taken a resolution that they would really want to speak to the powers that may be, that if they are not aware, maybe let them tell them, give them the human face of what this project is going to be. But one person said in the meeting, why are the Chinese coming to South Africa and proposing this mega toxic project? Why don't they do it in their own country? And the person further asked that she doesn't think that what is destined to be done here, to clear off the site, where the sacred sites, whether that could have been done in the investor's country.
Indeed. I mean, you know, while you're speaking, it just seems to me that this project is becoming South Africa's environmental Rubicon. And while I take your point that it's completely illegal, so it's not even as if you need a campaign. But we also do know that government is serious, and they've been serious for a long time. And the Limpopo Economic Development Agency is pushing right ahead. The Limpopo provincial government is pushing right ahead. DTI is pushing right ahead. And unfortunately, Barbara Creasy at Environment, Forestry and Fisheries is also pushing ahead. And I know, Bob, that you've been quite close to the environmental impact assessment, or the EMP, and you have an inside track on there too.
Yes, I think it's very telling that the president of China just a few weeks ago announced that China was committing itself to carbon neutrality, in the first half of the century. How would China achieve that? Well, they achieve that by exporting all their emissions to South Africa, and why would we be such suckers as to accept that, would be my question. The climate argument around this particular development is quite a subtle one. And so bear with me for a moment, because in fact, the emissions from one 3,000 megawatt power station, if we didn't do that, it would actually not change the global climate trajectory one little bit, because that's one power station amongst tens of thousands around the world. The point is that the future climates in this valley, the Limpopo Valley, without global efforts to mitigate climate change, will become unlivable. As South Africans, we like to think that we're tough. We can do hot weather, but we're looking at something like a 6 to 8 degrees Celsius temperature rise without mitigation in this area. If any of you have ever been to Messina, you will know that on a summer's day, it's pretty unbearable already. Add 8 degrees to that, and it becomes essentially unlivable. So in other words, if we want a future for any form of economic development in that area, whether it's tourism-based or culturally based or livestock-based, then we have to get the world to reduce its degree of climate change. And the only way we can do that is through mechanisms like the Paris Agreement. And we have no moral traction if we go to a mechanism like that and say, you've got to cut down your emissions, you've got to cut down the emissions. Oh, by the way, we've just opened this long-lasting coal-fired power station, which will increase our emissions for the next 50 years. That is simply just not a tenable position. So that's why I say the argument is a subtle one. It's not about the direct impacts of this on the global climate. They are real and negative, okay, but small in the big picture of things. It's around the loss of leverage that we have to get the world to do what it absolutely has to do, not only to save the Limpopo Valley, but to save South Africa as a whole and most other parts of the world. We have to get onto a radical decarbonization path, and this is not going to help.
Absolutely, and we published that report. I mean, at the height of lockdown, when South African attention was elsewhere. Our attention was on COVID-19, which dominated the headlines around the world, and certainly on Daily Maverick for at least 4 or 5 months. And when we published that first investigation, it was one of the first pieces, at the height of level 5 lockdown. It was the beginning of April. That wasn't specifically about COVID, but and Bob, you and I have had this discussion that you actually can't separate ecosystem collapse from COVID-19. It's a zoonotic disease. There's that famous cartoon that, it's become famous in the last 6 months among certain environmental activists. And you publish it in your report, where you've got, it's 3 waves. And the first wave, it's the little wave. It's COVID-19. The second wave is 3 times the size of the first one, and it's economic collapse. But then comes the massive tidal wave, and that's climate and ecosystem collapse. And Bob, I don't think there's anyone better than you to, as a systems ecologist, talk about COVID-19 being directly related as a zoonotic disease to ecosystem collapse, if not specifically climate collapse.
So, COVID-19, obviously the specifics were completely unpredictable. Nobody knew that a particular coronavirus would emerge in the city of Wuhan, and it would come from bats, and it would come in the beginning of December in 2019. But the general risk has been forecast for many, many years now, because we know, firstly, as humans penetrate more deeply into natural ecosystems, they're increasing their exposure to these reservoirs of diseases. So, in previous times, we weren't in such close interaction both with these reservoirs and with our domestic livestock, because they act often as the transition. So, for instance, most flu that we get around the world comes from to us via poultry and pigs, and it's in these very, very intensive agricultural situations where people are living with millions of pigs and millions of poultry birds in close connection, and then you have some way of it hopping out of its natural reservoirs into that. So that has been very widely predicted. It also is a result of the fact that we are chipping away at the natural disease regulation mechanisms in ecosystems. So ecosystems are fabulously complicated things with all kinds of checks and balances in them. And one of the checks and balances relates to outbreaks of diseases. And as we gradually simplify ecosystems, so for instance, you take a very complicated natural ecosystem with hundreds of species, thousands of species in it, and you reduce it down to a very simplified agricultural human system, which has got just millies and soybeans and 10 million chickens. That's a highly reduced ecosystem. So you increase your vulnerability, because if any element of that goes wrong, then the whole thing collapses. Whereas in a much more complicated ecosystem, there is functional redundancy. So if one bit collapses, other bits take over and they keep themselves in check and balance. So the general idea behind this has been well understood and actually well proven, for a couple of decades. And it shouldn't be as a surprise that it eventuated with COVID-19, and nor will that be the last one. We have seen a whole series of zoonotic episodes over the last couple of decades. Don't forget, HIV/AIDS is a zoonotic disease which emerged from human primate interactions in Central Africa. We've seen Ebola, which also came in that kind of route. We've seen MERS, which came up in the Middle East, and we've seen SARS-1. All of these are zoonotic diseases. They've been happening more and more frequently, and it's because of the fact that we are now putting the global biosphere under just such intolerable strain, and there's no part of it which is not kind of transformed and invaded by us.
Thank you for that, Bob. I seem to have frozen again. Makoma, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you very well.
Okay, wonderful. So Makoma, to pick up from that, it must have been frustrating for you as an environmental activist to have been working on a range of critical issues, not least of which is the Messina Mercado SEZ, and along comes COVID-19, and basically ecosystem collapse, climate collapse is relegated to the deep background. So, were you frustrated? How has it shifted the focus? How are things different now post the first wave of COVID to what they were pre the first wave?
Yeah, one thing I think the pandemic, though unexpected, also created a period or a moment for us to reflect on what's happening. And I think firstly that the pandemic came and we found that everyone panicked, from governments to ordinary people, and swift action was taken. And this tells us that we can do as that to mitigate against climate change. One is climate change. It's with us, it has been with us, and it requires all of us to act. So the way our governments acted, the UN acted, I think that's what we really need to do. And if we take lessons from how we reacted to the pandemic, that is how we can be able to react to the threat that's facing us, which is climate change. One thing that also happened is that the pandemic exposed some of the inequalities, but also some of the issues that are exacerbated by climate change. Food insecurity became one of the issues that was at the fore. that even though there's limitation of movement, nutritious food, it's needed for people so that people can be able to survive. The importance of uninterrupted water access became one of the issues that highlighted that this is supposed to be something continuous, because we don't know what may come again, another pandemic, or the pandemic may continue for quite a long time. So those inequalities of people not having food, of lack of access to water, were the issues. I think they also highlighted in the report that this is at the core of our survival as society. But what also the pandemic presented to us as activists, and also as people who are creating awareness around environmental rights, it's that our connection was somehow a little bit cut off. But however, we had to quickly adapt to the situation of doing things differently. And this is where we kind of amplified or increased our use of technological applications like the one we're using to engage continuously with ordinary people. But also that raised the issue of communication rights, that there's people don't have access to data, or data is not available, people cannot connect to Wi-Fi. But however, we're able to work around that so that there can be continuous engagement. And when level 1 was announced, that is when that we had to check with the constituencies, the people that we normally would have, because of we had adapted, that we would engage with them electronically, and we had to get from them if it's okay that we can, resume the physical or the face-to-face engagements, and that has helped. But I think with the pandemic, it has also given us that with technology, you can do more. And I think we had done more, and this is something that we had integrated into how we engage and how we work with people. Besides that, the reports that we got from the activists and some of the people who work with in different areas, from like in the Waterberg and here Musina Mercado, in the areas around Gauteng, in the other areas in the country, like in the Eastern Cape and other areas, people were able to observe changes, and some of the changes, I think, they have been noted globally, that the air quality suddenly improved because of less industrial activity, and also because people traveled less. So those are some of the things that really people are observing, and they formed part of our discussions, and forming part of our discussions. And then there's a strong drive towards trying to find a way on how we don't increase the emissions. And that's why people are now saying, let's revisit our indigenous knowledge systems, because our indigenous knowledge systems are not carbon intensive, and we can also be able to say what kind of food do we plant which is climate resistance. And we go back, particularly South Africa, to the food that our great parents and great grandparents were using, and also kind of revisiting some of the methods that they were using to save food and to save water. And besides that, and one of the things that also came into mind was, particularly for activists, to say, how do we really ensure that nationally this is done? And we found out there's legislation and regulations around water usage in the country, and that legislation would need to be implemented, and that's the kind of regulatory and policy frameworks that would also assist us. But this pandemic really presented itself opportunities for us to think outside of the box, to adapt, and to also do things differently, adapt to the new normal, or kind of create a new normal that we are going to engage in from now on towards the next, phase. And one of the things that also was kind of a limitation on our part, that we are unable to go to areas. The thing is, you go to a different area and you see things have changed. But however, that the pandemic has presented an opportunity, and they also assist us to think differently and to work differently, but also to put an emphasis on the highlighted inequalities that were evident at the start of the pandemic.
Thank you so much for that, Makoma. I mean, we've got a range of very urgent questions and very relevant questions coming in off of what you've just shared with us from your deep experience. And Mark Leroy asks, will it take a climate catastrophe in the order and short timescale of COVID-19 to force governments into greater action? And I'd like to direct that to you, Bob, in the context of as well, what areas, I mean, as a journalist, I'm not seeing government being that effective in any areas that we're looking at in terms of your report and the top 5 clusters. In fact, in most of them, I'm seeing government running at speed in the wrong direction. And I'm wondering what you're seeing. I mean, are there any areas there where government is making a positive impact?
So, to the question of will it take crisis to cause us to make the changes that we need to, unfortunately, when you look at the history of human action, that is almost always the case. And I think COVID nicely illustrates that. Once it was clear that this was a big problem and people could see it, they actually reacted very swiftly, and at least initially with a great deal of support for government actions, even though they were, difficult things and placed livelihoods at risk. So I think that we do need to experience, a whole lot of climate crises, not only us, but I think that you're seeing the opinion in places like the United States of America, which of course at a governmental level has been something of an impediment to reaching a global climate agreement, being changed on the ground by repeated tropical hurricanes and by massive wildfires in the West. So as these things, become a daily occurrence, I think it becomes much, much harder for governments to, push them into, the background as something that may happen in the future, but really we can't be fussed with it at the moment. So in terms of the risk area, remember that, let's pick, for instance, the water area. We know that South Africa had a water problem with or without climate change. South Africa only has a certain amount of what's called allocatable water, which is essentially the water which is in the river systems, the mean annual runoff. And as of a few years ago, that amount of water had already been fully allocated. In other words, we said this much to these uses, that much to those uses, completely allocated. There is no spare. And so as we go into the future, regardless of climate change, if some sector needs more of that, for instance, power generation or domestic use, then some sector has to get less. There's no slop in the system. When we add climate change onto that, in fact, that allocatable pie of water shrinks in South Africa. That just makes that whole thing so much more difficult. Now, South Africa realized that it was a water-stressed country several decades ago. And one of the first bits of legislation passed by the post-1994 government was the South African Water Act, which is admired world over because the whole world is in trouble around how you do this water allocation problem. We had water legislation which was in its origin Roman Dutch law, and had all kinds of grandfathered rights bolted onto that, just like other parts of the world, and was insoluble. There were allegedly only like 3 lawyers in the entire country who even understood the water law situation. And so we enacted a new water law in 1998, which provides us a basis for doing a just allocation of water resources, which is remarkable. So we have the tools. We don't always apply them. Okay, so for instance, key provisions of that act, have not been enacted. We could do so. We have the skills, we have the tools. We lack often the political will. Another area that I would highlight is in the ecosystems area. Now, South Africa is a mega biodiverse country. We've also been had a long history of punching above our weight in the conservation and biodiversity area. So we're regarded amongst the leading countries in this area around the world. And again, conceptually, we have the ideas. We have the infrastructure. We have the institutions. We've got a fantastic, world-renowned South African National Biodiversity Institute. We've got world-renowned South African National Park Service. But we don't always turn that comparative advantage of having the biodiversity, having the knowledge, having the institutions into being a world leader in practice.
Thank you for that, Bob. I mean, following on from there, just please confirm you can hear me. We seem to be having technical glitches. Am I coming through clear there?
I can hear you, thank you.
Great. So we've got a question from one of our...
I can hear you.
Okay, excellent. We've got a question from one of our great environmental journalists, Leonie Jaber, who will be familiar to all of you. And she asks, following on from what you've just said, Bob, because Africa needs to adapt ahead and mitigate, and ecosystem restoration is central to creating more resilient communities, we need public works efforts like working for water to pay for this. And Leonie says, but I don't see this coming through in just transition thinking. Makoma, can you respond to Leonie there?
I think what is important is that the African Union has got some protocols, and those protocols, I think our governments have got to adhere to. And some of the protocols are aligned with the regulations and policies that we have in our countries. And the problem that I always raise is that even if governments have got those beautiful legislation and regulations or policies, it's important that ordinary people, citizens in every country are familiar and they can be able to enforce that those are being followed, adhered to, and implemented.
So, Kevin, if I can come in on the question of the working for programs, the poverty relief and ecosystem services reconstruction programs, I'm an enormous supporter of them. They've been absolutely world leading. They've done wonderful work. But as a solution to the 21st century problem, okay, they fail in a couple of respects. One is that they are consumers of national wealth and redistributors of national wealth rather than generating wealth. And so we need to do things which actually generate income and well-being, not just spend money trying to damp down its negative consequences. And the only way to do that, in my mind, is to essentially leapfrog as Africa into a green economy without passing through the horrible brown economy that we were discussing in the earlier segment. In other words, why would we go, via a dirty smokestack step to get into the future when we know that the whole world is transitioning to something that Africa is rich in? Africa is rich in that, in renewable natural resources, in biodiversity, in all of the things that the green economy will be built on. So we should, step across to that and avoid going down into the situation which then needs to be rehabilitated. So as the big picture solution, that's what should be our top priority, rather than trying to apply band-aids post facto, which are really dependent on us having a robust fiscus, a robust national pot of money that we can redistribute. And already those programs under enormous stress in the post-COVID period because the tax system is in deep trouble. You can't fund those programs unless you've got money coming in. So how can we design ways to generate wealth in Africa based on our strengths, not following other people's weaknesses?
Indeed, indeed. Another strength we have in Africa and in South Africa is extant and still accessible bodies of indigenous knowledge. And Makoma, you're a member of the Board of Natural Justice. We have a mutual friend in its executive director, Puvan Mudli. I know this is a subject that's very close to your heart. You've been engaging with the Mulambwane community in Limpopo, I know, and across the country. Kolobeni, you've been paying attention to. How practically, in your opinion, and given the various boards that you sit on, and given your experience, and given what Bob's just said, how do we implement indigenous solutions on a national scale, and what might those solutions be?
Thank you for that. I think one important thing is for us in Africa, Southern Africa, the whole of Africa, to respect our ancient wisdoms. The solution. It's unfortunate that because of colonialism and imperialism, some of those practices were seen as being barbaric and not, kind of the situations that would save humanity. One of the things that are important is also for communities to have a voice. If people are living in a particular area, for an example, the Mulambwane community, that their land is being threatened by this mega toxic special economic zone, these are the people that should have the final decision making as to whether they would like to have this kind of project or not in their area. One thing that I found out is that the people in this area did not get information. So that means the free prior informed consent, they didn't have it all. So none of them doesn't know what this project is all about, what are the advantages of the project, what are disadvantages of the project, and that simply denies people to make informed decisions. But it seems like now the decision to have the project is being shoved down their throats, and I can say that they're not happy with that based on the statement that people developed to say we don't want this project. The rights, it's also in the Constitution, and within the environmental justice sector, that's why we have environmental justice, is that each and every person has got the right to be part of decision-making processes regarding the environment that they live in. So if people are denied that, so it becomes a violation of their rights. And as South Africans, so that we can learn from these ancient wisdoms, these are solutions towards us protecting our environments and also protecting the environment for the future generations. So that starts within the community, where the community would make decisions, where the community would decide whether they would want changes or they would really want to kind of continue as they are. We have this outstanding question of the land issue. In Mulambwane community also have claimed the land, and part of the land is the land that SEZ is going to build in. So it's important for them to be at the center stage of making decisions. And also, this area of the northern part of South Africa is very rich in indigenous knowledge systems. And this being very rich, and to your surprise, this is what I found yesterday, that most people here still believe in our own traditional medicines. The herbs, the amount of herbs that you find here, these help them for their complements, for them to live longer and to be much stronger, and the amount of trees that they use and stuff like that. So these indigenous knowledge systems are the kind of systems that are for the future, and we need to go back and use them again, and using them again to disrupt the problem that we find ourselves in, or to disrupt the crisis that is building each and every day where life is going to be extinct. So, but what is important is that the protocols that speaks about community involvement and their culture and how they can use that to further live on should be pursued and be protected, and that is within the legislation of South Africa, that indigenous rights, indigenous knowledge systems need to be protected, and this is or can be a solution towards a harmful
so we seem to have lost some voice coverage in there. Kevin, can I come in here and make some comments?
Please do, Bob. And we're 4 minutes from the end. I would love to hear your intervention on that. But also, you know, and I'm sure this is going to encompass your final word here. Tiara Walters, my colleague, and, you know, again, one of South Africa's really effective and impactful environmental journalists, is asking in this context, and in the context of the report specifically, the areas of hope, and how you know, researchers and scientists like yourself and activists like Makoma get up in the morning with things just seeming to get worse and worse and worse. So if you could please end off in the last 3 minutes on that, Bob, and your intervention there. Thank you.
So, you know, I'm a scientist, and so what's my position on indigenous knowledge? It may surprise you that I recognize the knowledge which has been generated over thousands of years by essentially ongoing experimentation. And that's what the power of indigenous knowledge is. But we should not put expectations on it which are beyond its capabilities, because it evolved over a period of time where the environment was in fact quite different from the environment that we're going into in the 21st century. So we should not expect that it should have ready-made solutions. Where I think indigenous knowledge, and I really like Makoma's phrasing of this, indigenous wisdom, is in fact incredibly part of our hopeful future, is in the way they conceptualize the relationship between people and nature. Much of the problem that the world finds itself in the 21st century is because of a very Western view of, we have nature on the one side and we have humans on the other side, and they're adversarial. So for us to get ahead, nature has to suffer, and that's just inevitable. You can't stand in the way of progress, etc., etc. We all know that narrative, and that's led us into, in fact, a life-threatening dead end. If you look at indigenous knowledge systems, they very seldom conceive of nature and human in that separated way. They conceive as humans as being part of nature. Therefore, damaging nature is kind of stupid. It's like cutting off your left arm. And so the hope that I see going into the 21st century is a fundamental rethink in how humans conceive of their relationship to the global biosphere, to nature, and seeing it as a way, in a way which takes consideration into both sides of that equation. And I see germs of that movement sprouting all over the world. And I think that as our climate crises and our other environmental crises become more severe, that will become much more a way of which people think about the problem than it is currently. And then finally, for many of our immediate problems, we do have the germs of technical solutions. We know how to generate energy in a decarbonized way. We know how to grow crops under, water-stressed situations. But we need to make sure that those become the norm rather than the exception.
Thank you so much, Bob. We are at the end of our session. Thank you again to APSA. Thank you to Makoma. Despite the technical glitches, I think this has been a very rich discussion. At Daily Maverick, we're very, very honored to host scientists and activists of the caliber and the nature of both of you. And we hope to have you back again soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Great pleasure.